The lecture hall at Harvard Business School hummed with an unspoken energy, a current of anticipation that crackled beneath the surface. Sunlight spilled through the towering windows in golden ribbons, tracing patterns across the polished mahogany desks where students sat poised, their fingers hovering over keyboards, notebooks open, pens at the ready. The air itself felt charged, thick with expectation, the weight of rigorous academic discourse pressing down on every occupant of the room. Each seat was filled, each mind tuned to the rhythm of the moment, ready to engage, to challenge, to absorb. This was Harvard, intellectual battlegrounds where ideas clashed, where theories were sharpened against the steel of debate, where futures were shaped in the crucible of relentless inquiry. But today carried an edge, something different, something more. At the front of the hall stood Professor Olivia Sinclair. She was more than just an educator. She was an institution unto herself, a force of intellect whose reputation extended far beyond the ivy-clad walls of Harvard. Her presence commanded attention, not just because of the weight of her credentials, not just because her lectures could unravel ideologies and leave even the most confident students grasping for footing, but because she thrived on the sheer art of dismantling pretense. With the precision of a surgeon, she carved away assumptions, leaving only the raw, naked essence of an argument behind. In her classroom, there was no room for complacency. Every mind had to be sharp, every opinion fortified, every student prepared to defend their beliefs against the relentless scrutiny of her gaze. Her steps were slow, deliberate as she approached the podium. A single glance swept over the room, an unspoken challenge in the way her eyes lingered, assessing. Some students met her gaze with boldness, eager for the intellectual duel that was about to unfold. Others shifted in their seats, unconsciously adjusting their posture, as if to steel themselves for what was coming. And then, with the weight of absolute authority, she spoke. Today we're discussing ethics in business. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ethics, the invisible force that could build or break empires, the fine, fragile line that separated ambition from exploitation, a subject that had dismantled legacies, ruined men who once seemed invincible, unearthing uncomfortable truths buried beneath layers of power and wealth. This was not a lecture to be taken lightly. This was an excavation, a peeling away of illusions until only the bare bones of reality remained. She began, as always, with precision, corporate responsibility, leadership integrity, the delicate balance between ambition and moral compromise. Her voice was steady, her delivery controlled, a measured rhythm that held the room captive. But then, subtly, intentionally, she shifted. A pause, the kind that made students sit up just a little straighter, their attention tightening like a drawn bowstring. A knowing smile ghosted the edges of her lips, something sharp glinting in her eyes. Let's talk about Donald Trump. The atmosphere in the room constricted, almost imperceptibly. A ripple of awareness passed through the students, a flicker of exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, the promise of intellectual confrontation stirring something electric in their expressions. Others stiffened, glancing toward the front row, toward one particular student who sat motionless, unflinching, as if carved from stone. Professor Sinclair's voice remained smooth, but beneath it lay a current of amusement, a subtle provocation. A so-called billionaire, she mused, the words deliberate, chosen for effect, whose ethics are as questionable as his hairline. A tremor of laughter flickered through the room, hesitant at first, nervous, uncertain. Some chuckled outright, their gazes darting toward their peers to gauge reactions. Others remained silent, sensing the sudden tension thickening like a gathering storm. It was a moment balanced on the knife's edge, the intersection of academia, ideology, and something far more personal. A moment that could fracture or fortify, depending on what came next. And then there was Barron Trump. He sat still, a portrait of quiet defiance, an enigma wrapped in composure. His expression revealed nothing, not a trace of reaction to the professor's words, not even the slightest flicker of discomfort. His hands rested lightly on the edge of his notebook, fingers motionless, posture perfectly controlled. But for those who knew how to read the unspoken, those attuned to the subtleties of human reaction, there was something there, an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, a fleeting shadow of tension that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Professor Sinclair took his silence as an invitation. Emboldened, she pressed forward, her voice carrying the crisp edge of conviction as she dissected, piece by piece, the empire of Donald Trump. With meticulous precision, she unraveled the threads of every misstep, every lawsuit, every deal that had ever courted controversy. She painted a portrait of recklessness, of ambition unchecked, of power wielded with a dangerous lack of foresight. And then the room changed. The laughter that had sparked so easily at the professor's earlier remarks had died out, leaving in its wake a stillness so thick it felt almost tangible. The air itself seemed to tighten, anticipation crawling along the skin of every student present. Gazes flickered toward Barron, uncertainty blooming in their eyes. Would he speak? Would he lash out? Would he stand up and leave? But Barron Trump did none of those things. He waited. He absorbed every word, every syllable, allowing them to settle, to take their full shape in the air before him. And when the professor delivered what she clearly believed to be her final, most damning blow, he moved. Not in some grand theatrical gesture, no slam books, no harshly spoken rebuttals. No, his movement was something far more subtle, far more intentional. A shift in his chair, the quiet lift of his hand. The tension in the room tightened, drawn like a bowstring. Professor Sinclair hesitated for the briefest moment, the sharp edge of her certainty momentarily flickering. But then, regaining her composure, she nodded toward him. Yes? For the first time since the lecture had begun, Barron Trump spoke. His voice was calm, remarkably so. Not a hint of defensiveness, no agitation, just measured, deliberate words that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. I appreciate the analysis, Professor. He met her gaze without flinching, his tone steady, unwavering. But I think there's more to the story than just headlines and public perception. A murmur rippled through the hall, a shift in the air that spoke of something unexpected. No one had anticipated this. No one had expected him to speak, much less with such composed certainty. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers lacing together, his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. Success isn't about one person, he continued, voice smooth but resolute. It never has been. It's about the people behind it, the ones who believe in a vision, even when the odds are against them. He let the weight of his words settle, let them sink in, his gaze sweeping across the room before returning to the professor. I've seen that firsthand, he said, quieter now, but no less powerful. Hard work, loyalty, resilience. Those are the values that build something real. Those are the things that matter. The silence that followed was different from before. Not the kind born of tension, not the breathless stillness of anticipation, but something else entirely. A pause filled with thought, a moment that could not be dismissed. Barron Trump had spoken, and no one could ignore him now. Something shifted. A subtle but undeniable current ran through the lecture hall. A few students straightened in their seats, their expressions no longer laced with amusement, but with something closer to contemplation. Others exchanged uncertain glances, as if reevaluating everything they had assumed about the young man who sat before them. Silent for so long, yet now commanding the room with nothing but his presence and his words. Barron wasn't here to deliver a knee-jerk defense of his father. He wasn't here to blindly counter every argument thrown his way. No, he was here for something else entirely. He was here to challenge the narrative, to reshape the conversation. His tone softened, though the quiet conviction beneath it remained unshaken. I understand that public figures, especially my father, are open to criticism, he said, his voice steady, deliberate. And they should be. Accountability matters. He let the words settle, let them breathe in the air thick with tension. Then after a pause, he continued, his gaze sweeping the room. But I also think there's a difference between constructive criticism and turning someone into a symbol for everything we believe is wrong with the world. The weight of his statement lingered, pressing against the silence. No one moved. No one dared to interrupt. No one is perfect, and no one succeeds alone, Barron continued, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that didn't demand attention. It simply held it. If we're going to have conversations about leadership and ethics, we should talk about the full picture, not just the parts that fit the narrative we prefer. And that silence that followed, it wasn't empty. It was charged. For the first time since she had begun her lecture, Professor Sinclair looked reflective. The sharp confidence she had wielded with such certainty now held the faintest trace of something else. Thoughtfulness, consideration. Slowly she reached for her marker. But then, instead of turning back to the board, she set it down. She took a step away from the podium, crossing her arms, regarding him in a way that no longer felt like a challenge, but something closer to measured respect. And then she nodded. You make a fair point, she admitted, her voice quieter now. It's easy to focus on the negatives, especially when discussing someone as polarizing as your father. But you're right. There's always more to the story. Barron gave a simple, unassuming nod. Thank you for listening. For a moment, the weight of everything that had been said held the room in perfect stillness. It was as if no one quite knew what to do with what had just transpired, as if they were still processing the shift that had taken place. Then one clap. Then another. And another. It wasn't loud. It wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't some grand, thunderous applause. But it was there. A quiet, unmistakable ripple of acknowledgement that spread through the hall. A recognition of something that had cracked through the surface of expectation and demanded to be heard. Professor Sinclair glanced around, taking in the reaction. And in that moment, for the first time that day, the sharp confidence in her posture softened. Not in defeat, but in something else. Respect. As students packed up their belongings, the usual murmur of conversation slowly returning to the room, a young woman hesitated near Barron's desk. Hey, she said softly, lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. I just wanted to say, what you said really resonated with me. I think a lot of us needed to hear that. Barron met her gaze, offering a small, polite smile. Thanks. I just think it's important to remember that there's always more to the story. And then, as he stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, the conversation still echoed in his mind. He hadn't sought attention. He hadn't spoken for validation. But this moment, it wasn't about attention. It was about perspective. And maybe, just maybe, it was about planting a seed. This wasn't just a debate. It was a lesson in composure, integrity, and the power of speaking truth in a world that thrives on narratives. Have you ever seen someone challenge the status quo and completely shift the conversation? What do you think about Barron's response? Share your thoughts in the comments. Down arrow fire. If you believe in standing firm, challenging bias, and seeing the full picture, hit subscribe now. Don't miss more powerful stories that make you think.